One came from Motown, polished, precise, built for crossover. The other came from the gospel church, raw, uncontainable, built for something older than pop music. Through the first half of the 1960s, they moved in parallel. Two women from Detroit, two voices of uncommon power, two different definitions of what a black female artist could be in America. For years, one of them seemed to have the answer. She had the hits, the television appearances, the label, and the most successful independent record company in history behind her. And then, in the spring of 1967, the other one walked into a recording studio in Alabama, and the question of who owned American music had to be asked all over again. This is the story of Diana Ross and Aretha Franklin. By 1966, Diana Ross and the Supremes had become something American pop music had not quite seen before. They had placed 12 singles at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in less than 3 years, a rate of commercial success that placed them alongside the Beatles in any discussion of the decade's dominant forces. They were Motown's defining act, the proof of Berry Gordy's formula: polished production, precise choreography, crossover designed to reach every radio in America, regardless of what neighborhood it sat in. Diana Ross was the face of all of it. Her voice was not the raw instrument that gospel produces. It was controlled, deliberate, shaped for recording rather than revival. What she had was presence, timing, and instinct for the song rather than the sermon. Motown had built her into something enormous, and she had grown into it completely. Aretha Franklin, in those same years, was not yet what she would become. She had been signed to Columbia Records in 1960, a major label, real evidence that someone had heard what she was capable of. But Columbia did not know what to do with her. They placed her voice in pop settings, jazz arrangements, orchestral productions that had nothing to do with where that voice had been formed. The record sold modestly. Critics noted her talent and moved on. For 6 years, one of the greatest voices in American music history recorded for a label that consistently missed what it had. She was Reverend C.L. Franklin's daughter, raised in the church, trained in a tradition that had no interest in Motown's crossover calculations. The voice was there. The material, the setting, the producer who understood what the voice required. None of that had arrived yet. That changed in 1967. In the fall of 1966, Aretha Franklin left Columbia and signed with Atlantic Records. Her new producer was Jerry Wexler, a man who had spent his career working with artists whose music lived closer to the ground than anything Columbia had been willing to record with her. In January 1967, Wexler took Aretha to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, Fame Studios, a room used to record rhythm and blues in the heat of the American South, with session musicians who played like the music was already inside them before they sat down. The session that began on January 24th was not planned as a historic moment. There was no announcement, no strategy document, no industry event surrounding it. Just a pianist, a band, a voice, and a producer who finally understood what he was working with. Within hours of Aretha sitting at the piano, everyone in that room understood they were recording something that had not existed before that afternoon. The record that announced Aretha's arrival was not an original composition. Respect had been written and recorded by Otis Redding in 1965, a man requesting deference from a woman when he came home. Aretha took the song and reversed its entire gravity. In her version, the word was not a request. It was a declaration, something that arrived with a force the original had never carried and had never needed to carry because it had been written from the other direction entirely. The single was released in April 1967. It reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and held the position. It crossed every format line American radio had constructed to keep certain music in certain places. Critics who had been waiting for Aretha to find her context understood immediately that the wait was over. The Supremes were still placing records on the charts, but within the industry, everyone understood that something fundamental had shifted. What followed 1967 was not a sudden dethroning. It was something more gradual, and, in many ways, more difficult to absorb if you were on the losing side of it. Aretha released a series of major singles through 1967 and 1968, each one reinforcing what Respect had established. Her album, Lady Soul, arrived in January 1968 to reviews that placed her beyond genre, not simply a great R&B vocalist, but one of the defining voices of her generation. The Supremes continued to chart. Diana Ross continued to be one of the most visible performers in American music. The commercial machinery that Motown had built did not stop running. But the critical conversation, the language used to describe who was essential, who was speaking to something larger than a hit single, had moved. It had moved to Aretha. And in the music industry, the critical conversation is often the first signal of where everything else will eventually follow. In February 1968, the city of Detroit made it official. Aretha Franklin was named Queen of Soul in a ceremony that gave formal recognition to what American music had already understood for months. She received a proclamation from the city, the same city where Diana Ross had grown up, where Berry Gordy had built Motown, where the Supremes had become what they became. Detroit claimed Aretha. The timing was not lost on anyone paying attention. Diana Ross was, at this moment, still leading the Supremes, still one of the most commercially successful performers in the country. But the title had gone to someone else, and the industry had not objected. There was no competing proclamation. What Diana Ross thought about the crown given to Aretha in the city they had both come from, she addressed it only indirectly in interviews that came years later. And what she said was more complicated than the rivalry narrative had ever allowed for. In 1970, Diana Ross left the Supremes and launched her solo career. The transition had been planned carefully. Berry Gordy had been building toward it for some time, shaping the move to ensure Diana's individual stardom would survive the separation from the group that had made her name. For the first time, she was in direct competition with Aretha on equal terms. No longer the face of a collective phenomenon, but a single voice, releasing albums that would be measured against every other single voice in American music. The 1970s became contested ground. Both women released major records. Both performed at the highest level of the industry. Both attracted audiences that overlapped more than either camp preferred to acknowledge. The gap between Motown's polished world and Atlantic's rawer tradition had narrowed considerably. And the two women who had come to represent those worlds were now competing for the same space, with no group structure to separate their names. In 1972, Diana Ross starred in Lady Sings the Blues, a film based on the life of Billie Holiday. The performance earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. By any measure, it was a significant achievement. A pop artist crossing into dramatic film and receiving recognition from Hollywood's most prestigious institution, Aretha Franklin had her own relationship with Billie Holiday's music and legacy. In interviews following the film's release, she was reported to have expressed reservations about the casting, suggesting, in the careful public language she typically used, that Holiday's roots in jazz and the blues might have been better served by a different kind of voice. The comments were widely noted. Diana Ross did not respond directly in public, but those who knew both women described the exchange as one of the few moments in their parallel careers when the tension between them became audible rather than simply implied. Between 1968 and 1975, Aretha Franklin won the Grammy Award for Best Female R&B Vocal Performance every single year the award was given. 8 consecutive years. A record in that category that has not been approached since. Diana Ross received Grammy nominations across her career, but did not match that consistency in the R&B categories. The Grammys are an imperfect measure. The industry has always understood this. But as public tallies go, they communicated something that neither woman could ignore. In the category that defined both of their careers, one of them had been declared the standard by the most prominent institution in American music. Year after year, without interruption, Aretha accepted each award with the gravity of someone who understood exactly what it represented. Diana watched from the same industry through all 8 years. What that cost and what it quietly built between them is the part of the story that was never told in full. For Aretha, Diana Ross represented the path she had not taken, and, in some ways, the path that had been built before she arrived. Motown's crossover strategy had made certain things possible for black artists in American mainstream culture. It had opened formats, integrated stages, placed black faces on television programs that had previously been closed to them. Diana Ross, as the most visible face of that strategy, had carried a weight that extended well beyond her own career. But that strategy also required accommodation, a calibration toward what mainstream audiences were comfortable receiving, a smoothing of edges that the music had been built to keep sharp. Aretha had never made that accommodation. Her music demanded that the listener come to it, rather than the other way around. The tension between those two approaches and what each of them cost was never spoken directly between the two women, but it was present in everything they made. For Diana, Aretha represented something more difficult to name, and something that her position at Motown made complicated to acknowledge publicly. Aretha's voice was, by common consensus, the greater instrument. Critics said it. Peers said it. Producers who had worked with both said it. This was not a controversial position in the music industry. It was simply the assessment that the available evidence consistently supported. What that meant for Diana, a woman who had built one of the most successful careers in American music on the strength of presence, timing, and an instinct for what a song required, is not something she addressed in most interviews. But in the ones where she did speak carefully about Aretha, what emerged was not rivalry in the simple sense. It was something closer to recognition, the kind that is genuinely difficult to give, and, for the person receiving it, more difficult still to hold without complication. Their careers continued in parallel for decades. They were in the same rooms at the same ceremonies year after year, careful with each other in the way that people are careful when the stakes of a wrong word are high. Aretha Franklin died in August 2018. She was eulogized as the greatest singer America had ever produced. Diana Ross was among those who spoke of her publicly in terms that carried genuine weight, what they were to each other. Rivals, mirrors, the standard each needed to measure herself against was never resolved into a simple story. Both of them knew what the other had that they did not. Neither ever said it plainly. Two voices from the same city, two different answers to the same question. Which one carried the greater weight, and what would American music look like without both of them? Two legends, two perspectives, one story that history almost forgot. Diana Ross built the crossover that opened the door. Aretha Franklin walked through it and changed the room. But which of them carried the greater weight? And what would American music look like without both of them? Tell us in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories like this one, subscribe. There's more where that came from.